As we continue to walk through the book of Ecclesiastes, we turn now to chapter 8. Turn your attention to chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. Who is like the wise? And who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme. And who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps the command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. There's no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun. When man had power over man to his hurt, then I saw the wicked buried that used to go in and out of the holy place. And they were praised in the city where they had done such things. Well, this also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There is a vanity that takes place on earth, and there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity, and I commend joy. For man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and to be joyful. For this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes sleep, then I saw all the works of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. Amen. Please be seated. And please raise your hand right now if you are drinking hot coffee. Let me see those hands. Yep, you're nuts. But I'm a nut with you. These are the true coffee lovers. We're all sweating. It's hot, I get it, but man, there's people drinking hot coffee right now. That says something. We do have reason to be thankful. When I heard the thunder this morning, I remembered the terrible emotions I had last summer when we were only meeting outside exclusively, wondering how in the world we would have a service outside, under the umbrellas, under the tents with lightning and thunder. But now when I hear the thunder on a Sunday morning, here we have this amazing and beautiful place. Yes, a bit warm, but you would be warm outside as well, and muddy, and more wet than you are. So here we are inside. I'm thankful to have this place to go when the rain comes. And here we are, turning the corner on the back end of Ecclesiastes. We'll finish this book in just a few weeks, but here we are in chapter 8, taking a look at life under the sun. That's what Ecclesiastes is about. That's what Solomon, the author, is trying to get us to see and to wrestle with and to learn how to navigate life under the sun. That is life as we know it, life as we see it. He speaks much of life under the sun being meaningless, but we've spoken in the past weeks of how what this really speaks to is not a true meaninglessness, but it's speaking to the momentariness of life under the sun. Everything that you grab your a hold of, even good things that bring pleasure and joy and love, they're vaporous, they're momentary. We've spoken of how Solomon, the author, is not being pessimistic, but he is giving us perspective. Every week, every chapter, he's giving us perspective from a different angle so that we will wisely navigate life under the sun. We've also said he's not a hopeless man, and he's not asking us to be hopeless, but he is an honest man, and he's asking us to be honest. We can't avoid some of the harsh realities of life in this world. That's why here in chapter 8, he begins with a question, who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of everything? His point there is to say, not many. There's not many who know how to wisely navigate life under the sun with all of the complexities. But he is writing so that we would be among the wise who know how to navigate life under the sun. When he speaks of wisdom here, and his desire is that we would be wise, he's speaking of wisdom in the way that James, the New Testament author, speaks of wisdom. In chapter 1 of James, James says if we ask the Lord for wisdom, he'll give it. The same kind of wisdom James is speaking of is the same kind of wisdom Solomon's dealing with here. It's not the kind of wisdom that knows with precision whether or not you should take a left or a right at the fork in the road. It's not the kind of wisdom that somehow has accurate predictions about things. It's the kind of wisdom that reveals the posture of a person when you stand at the fork in the road. It's wisdom in the sense of your character and your posture. When you're at a fork in the road, when you don't know what tomorrow holds, when you find yourself in tribulation, as James speaks of, it's the kind of character that has a patience and a love and a hope and a courage and a steadfastness and a steady-handedness to be able to face these things because you know who you are as a person of faith. And that's what Solomon is speaking of here. Not many have the kind of wisdom to deal with the complexities of life under the sun, but he's writing so that we will become wise. He says when you get this kind of wisdom, it'll be written all over your face. That's what he means when he says a man's wisdom makes his face shine and the hardness of his face is changed. I so appreciate, by the way, do I have one here? No. I so appreciate the cover art on the bulletin. Jay Holliday, well done. Again, a member of our church who draws out art that reflects the sermon passage every week, and it's very creative this morning, but if you'll notice on your cover, there is the picture of a man whose hardness of soul, hardness of face is turned to a face that is shining. What he's talking about here is not the ability to manipulate your facial expressions to please other people. He's talking about the kind of genuine wellness of soul, the kind of genuine joy and faith that you simply can't hide. And he pictures that here as a face that's shining. You know, life is complex. Life is hard. It's amazing, isn't it, that the older people get, no one stays neutral. Most err in the direction of a certain hardness of soul. There's a bitterness that adds up. There's hurts and regrets that adds up over life. And it's difficult to grow older and softer in heart, to grow older with a face that's shining. Typically, people move in the direction of a hardness of face, a hardness of heart. But he's saying here, the goal is a face that shines. Now keep that in mind because we'll come back to that here in just a moment. Well, the particular issue that will harden a person's face, that will harden a person's soul that he's dealing with here in this chapter, we see in the beginning of chapter 2. What he's dealing with here is the harshness and the difficulty of certain people who are over you with a power. A political power, actually, he begins with. And then he moves to deal with not the people with power who are over you politically, but he moves to talk about the everyday people who are around us. And he's saying from both of those directions, from those who are over us and from those who are around us, there will be difficulties and complexities in this life that will make you hard unless you have the kind of wisdom he's talking about. And so let's begin looking at what he says in verse 2. Notice he says, I say, keep the king's command. Here he's moving into the political realm. He's moving into the realm of people living under the political authority of others. Of course, in his day, a monarchy, but he knew very well that in the days and years to come, there would be kings from his nation and from the surrounding nations who would not be good kings. He knew himself to be a broken king. And yet he says, I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Don't take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. What's he talking about there? Well, when he says keep the king's command, he's talking about the very thing that's spoken of in the New Testament. He's talking about honoring, guarding the word and the commands of the king, or as the New Testament says, our governing authorities. Honor the commands of our governing authorities. And he says there, be not hasty to go from his presence. Be not hasty to go from his presence. What he's speaking of there in his context is the privilege it is to have a king or a governing authority, first of all, and to have some participation in the court of this king or this governing official. Be not hasty to go from his presence. He's speaking of those times when you may disagree with the king, or when the king does something that you say is wrong, or he should have made this or that decision. He's saying, don't be hasty, don't be overly impulsive and reactionary to go from the king's presence and to publicly shame the wisdom or the lack thereof of the king or the governing authority. Now, in the ancient Near East, people took vows to their kings. When we're told here that we're to keep the king's command because of God's oath to him, the scholars are really 50-50 on whether this is speaking of God's oath to the governing authorities, or it's the oath that the people took pledging allegiance to the governing authority. But either way, it matters to us because we, as American citizens, have pledged our allegiance to our governing authorities. That's a biblical thing, as God makes clear in the New Testament. Romans chapter 12, for example, we are to honor our governing authorities. When those words were written by the Apostle Paul, he was speaking of governing authorities that were not wise, they were evil, they were hurtful, and very much against the cause of the Christian faith. Nevertheless, he said, these governing authorities have been put in their place for a particular reason, to guard and to promote and to protect life, to bring justice. Honor them. Now, our allegiance that has been pledged is not an ultimate allegiance. And so we can speak about pledging our allegiance to governing authorities so long as we know we're not speaking of an ultimate allegiance, because the day comes where we make it clear our ultimate allegiance is to the Lord, as the apostles discovered when they were doing evangelism in the book of Acts, and they were told to no longer speak in the name of Christ by various authorities, and they said, we must obey God rather than men. So our ultimate allegiance is to Christ, but there's a common biblical language of honoring our governing authorities, not being so hasty to leave, in our case, the public square, the public discussions. We're not to run off to a cave to have nothing to do with this. We have the privilege to participate in a certain political system here in the United States, and we should not be hasty no matter how much we disagree with whoever's governing, whether locally or nationally at the present time. We're not to be hasty or overly reactionary is what he's saying. There will be a time when you need to take a stand. It's been amazing to me, actually, over these past weeks. I've received many, many more calls than ever before of people wanting to meet, to talk about the complexities at their workplace where they're feeling certain pressures now to conform to certain wishes of governing authorities or the authorities at their workplace who are seeking to conform to various values that are being signaled by our governing authorities. And there's really a spectrum of various issues people are dealing with. And as people have come to me and as we've talked through these various issues, actually this week in some of my conversations I pointed to this and shared the wisdom that we need to be careful to not be overly reactionary. We don't want to be like the boy who cried wolf, where every time there's anything we disagree with, we are up in arms and on social media, publicly shaming. Well, the wisdom here is to not be hasty, to go from their presence. The reason we're not like the boy who cried wolf, who's always complaining, is because there will be a time when we really do need to cry out. There will be a time when we need to take a serious stand. And when that day comes, when our conscience is bound and we must stand up and say, I must obey God rather than men, I will not obey you or honor something that will lead me or my family or other people into sin or destruction, we take that stand. And that stand will matter, and it won't be like white noise, because we as Christians are the ones who have been wise in the way that we navigate these complex political matters, even when it comes to your workplace and your home. You know, in the 4th century, when Rome was so set against this Christian church, one of the things that saved, in many respects, the church from the attempt of utter destruction is the reality that many of the leaders, including Augustine, were able to point to the fact that it's the Christians who were the best citizens. It was the Christians who gave their governing authorities the least amount of headaches. They were those who were supportive and honoring and who generally obeyed the wishes of the government, unless it crossed the line, because their ultimate allegiance lies with the Lord. And so we too should be known not as those who give our governing authorities headaches, but as the best of citizens. Now look at verses 5 and 6. He says, whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing. The wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. There is a time and a way for everything. Just before that, he says, the king's going to do whatever he wants anyway. Public opinion is going to go where it's going to go, and you're not going to stop it. Our governing authorities, they have a lot of power, more power than you, and so be very careful when you take your stand. Make sure you won't regret it. Make sure it's for the right reasons, because they can bring a lot of destruction to you. And here he says, there will be a time for that. And you'll know the time and the way. The time's coming when you will need to take a stand, and it may bring destruction to you. It may mean the loss of a job. It may mean the loss of a standing in a community, but you'll know with all your heart it was the right thing to do. There's a time and a way, he says, so be watchful, be wise. There is a time and a way to say no to the king, to say no to the governing authorities, to say, yes, I will obey the Lord. And we're wise to God's truth and how clear it is in the Scriptures. And the degree that it's clear in the Scriptures, we stand by that truth with all our hearts and without regrets. But notice, he says, even though there's a time and a way to deal with these things, even though there's a time and a way, he says in verse 6, man's trouble still lies heavy on him. In other words, when you take your stand in the right time and in the right way, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to fix all your problems. In fact, it may bring more problems into your life, because as you take the right stands in the right way for the Lord our God, you don't know what tomorrow holds. And that brings a heavy heart to us. Notice he goes into a list here of how unknown tomorrow is and how out of control we are, of how certain people in the world may use their powers against us. He says, no man has power to retain the Spirit. Actually, a better interpretation of that is no one has the power to restrain the wind. Spirit and wind are the same word there. He's speaking there of the power of the wind, and when it comes, you know how helpless you are. No one has power to restrain the wind, or power over the day of death. You don't have that kind of power. You don't have that kind of knowledge. There's no discharge from war. In other words, you can't keep certain wars from coming. War is a reality, whether it's in your life personally and relationally at the workplace, or whether it's nationally. You don't have the power to keep war from coming your way, and nor will wickedness deliver you. In other words, you may hatch a scheme that you think is a brilliant scheme to get out of some trouble, but it's a compromise in some way. He says, no. There's no scheme you can hatch up that will deliver you. We need to recognize, on the one hand, our ultimate allegiance to the Lord, and on the other hand, how in this life under the sun, when we live with wisdom for the Lord and take our stands in the right way and in the right time, there will be trouble, and you can't control it. And that's a reality we have to face with life under the sun. My family and I recently took a very high-level educational class together, perhaps a combination of social studies and poli-sci and history. But we were in an Uber car together, and I would encourage you to take advantage of these great opportunities for education to strike up conversations with your Uber drivers. And we did that as a family and began asking questions about where this person lives and where he's from and about his family. And Alfredo was from Cuba, and he made it clear that he was getting ready to move to Philadelphia with his wife. She was received into a prestigious opportunity to move forward in her dental education and career. And as we began talking to Alfredo, he told us that his wife had previously been a dentist in Cuba, where they grew up and where they lived. And so, of course, we asked the question, don't you miss your family? And why would you come here to pay this large amount to go to Philadelphia for dental school when she was already practicing dentist? And Alfredo opened up a bit, and he said, she did practice dentistry in Cuba. In fact, all of her schooling was completely paid for. But what most people don't realize is because her education was free, when she left, she was told by the governing authorities where she must practice. And it was in an obscure place far away from home that was not desirable to live. And if you questioned that, or sought to go somewhere else, or complained about that, your degree would be taken away because it was the government who gave it to you. Now, my point here, though there is a political statement, that is not my point. My point here is the fact that though freedom was offered to this family, that freedom meant that her governing authorities owned her. They owned her records. They owned her degree. They could take it away. They did take it away. They owned where she lived. They owned her. They owned her. And they sought a new political system. So they moved here. They sought a new place where they would not be owned. If she wanted to start a certain dental practice in a certain place, she is able to, of course, with the proper degrees and whatnot. And so they came to a new place. And yet he went on to tell us about various troubles they're facing even right now. She was offered freedom. They owned her even to their hurt. Notice his words there in verse 9. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. When man had power over men and women to their hurt. Alfredo told us a very real story of those above him with power who owned them to their hurt. And every one of us, in some way, in life under the sun, will deal with this in the workplace. We'll deal with this in our own families, where God has designed a certain structure of authority. We will deal with this in the church, where the brokenness and the sinfulness and the selfishness of man, from government on down to the family and to the businesses you work at in the church in between, there is hurt whenever there is the misuse of authority. Solomon's saying this is a reality of life under the sun. It's complex. You need great wisdom. You need great wisdom to know how to deal with this. Notice he moves on in verses 10 through 14. He changes his tune a little bit. Now he's no longer talking of those who are over you with authority, who misuse that authority. He's now speaking of the everyday people who are around us. In verses 10 through 14. He speaks here, notice, he says, I saw the wicked buried. That was actually a positive thing in their day. People who received no honor or applause from their family or community were left unburied as a statement to say this was not a life worthy of burial. But I saw, Solomon says, the wicked received the honor of a good burial. They used to go in and out of the holy place. Oh man, I knew what they were like behind the scenes, but there they were, week in and week out, going to church and singing the songs and going to worship. They used to go in and out of the holy place, and they were praised in the city. People loved them. They were praised. Their life was promoted, and they were popular. They were praised in the city where they had done those very things that were evil. Solomon's saying here, this is the reality of life under the sun. All around us, there are people who act out in the most evil ways, and yet they live longer, oftentimes. They're more popular. They have the job and career advancement over you. It seems to go better with their family. It may seem to go better with their health. That's why he says here in verse 12, though a sinner does evil 100 times, his life is prolonged. And this is a vexing matter for Solomon. How is it that the good people are treated like the bad people, and the bad people are treated like the good people? How is it that the bad people can hide things so much that they're celebrated and promoted as the most popular, even among the spiritual elite? That's what he's speaking of here in verses 10 through 14. There's a certain praise toward evil, and that moves into a wider group of people promoting that evil, and this simply becomes promoted at a popular level. I think we know something of that in our culture, don't we? Where there's something that may be shocking at first if you think back through past decades, And then it, becomes a little bit more common and even praised, and then it's embraced and it's promoted, and then at a popular level it becomes normal, it becomes good. Actually, you become evil for not promoting and praising that which you deem to be evil. That's vexing as we live this life under the sun. It is amazing how that happens, isn't it? Isn't it amazing how things just sort of become popular over time, and we promote things that I just don't know why. Let me tell you how crazy our world has gotten. Just the other day, I saw a middle-aged man jogging, and it looked like maybe he hadn't been jogging in a while, and he was wearing very short spandex. That's how crazy our world has gotten. You tell me how that has become popular. Well, at some time and place, I guess it was promoted that middle-aged guys like me it was not me, wears short spandex with a shirt tucked in. That's not good and shouldn't be popular, but it is. I was in a group of people this past week where an adult out of nowhere started singing the Baby Shark song. Just out of nowhere, it popped in his head, and he started singing this song. Do you see the words of Solomon when he says in verse 11, because a sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil? You see what he's saying there? When something is not rightly seen to be not fitting for society, when something is not dealt with, when something is just accepted, even promoted at a popular level to be a good thing when it's really evil, what happens? Of course, more and more people say, well, this is good. That's exactly what he's saying in verse 11. When a sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. People grow up in a world. Our next generation comes into a world where certain things are promoted, and they're popular, and they're accepted. And so more and more people say this is good, like the man who's running in short spandex with his shirt tucked in, and the man who's singing Baby Shark. And those, of course, are small and an attempt to be humorous examples, but we know there are many more things that are much heavier and weightier where we see this in our world. But Solomon says this is a reality of life under the sun. And in all of this, verse 14, in all of this, the righteous are treated like the unrighteous, and the unrighteous are treated like the righteous. It seems to go well for those who do what's wrong, and it seems not to go well often for those who do what is right. Well, we have to ask the question, okay, Solomon, this is pretty heavy. As we've seen every week, there is a darkness to the way he speaks about life under the sun. I hope you have seen also that there is always hope beyond the darkness. Solomon is writing to give us this perspective. And so what's the answer to these vexing issues of the harsh, hurtful ways of people over us, and the harsh and hurtful and irrational ways of people around us in this society in which we live? What's the answer, Solomon? Verses 12 through 13, in verses 12 through 17, he begins to give us the answer to what's happening here. Notice in verses 12 through 17, he almost slips up a little bit when he says, I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. Solomon hasn't spoken much about that yet. He's really stuck to his guns of dealing with life under the sun, but we know as the covenant king, we know that he, as a believer, is speaking as one who knows there is a God who is over life under the sun, who's made certain promises to us, and he's waiting until the end to become more clear about this, but here he sort of slips up, it seems, and he just can't help himself of speaking of the fear of God, and he goes on to talk of the implications of that. When he says, I commend joy, for man has nothing better to do under the sun but to eat and to drink and to be joyful. He's giving us some answers here. Let me tell you what the answer is. There's 3 A's that Solomon leaves us with, and I'll leave you with these 3 A's. This is the answer to these particular issues of living life under the sun. First of all, he's saying we need to live with a certain awe. That's the first, a certain awe. We need to live with awe. When he says we need to fear God. You know, we often talk about this when we come to a verse that talks about the fear of God, because we talk about fear in such wrong ways. When we talk about fear, we usually talk about fear in the kind of way that we're fearful of a spider, and you know, certain phobias like arachnophobia, of which I guess I'll raise my hand, and I have passed that on to some of my children. But when the Bible talks about fearing God, it's not talking about the kind of fear that we have when we talk about being fearful of a spider. You see, if you're in a room with a spider and you run out of that room, and I'm picturing my daughter Molly here. Molly, forgive me, because she will run out of the room if she sees a spider. If you run out of a room because you say, I'm fearful of spiders, in the room you run into, there is a ferocious lion waiting to devour you and a roar that makes your hair stand. All of a sudden, you are no longer afraid of a spider. You will run back into the room with the spider and lock the door. The spider will become your best friend when the fear of the lion comes upon you. You know, I don't know if you've heard the roar of the lion or the tiger at the Detroit Zoo, but it is fearful. It's awful. It's awesome. Solomon here, when he talks about fearing God, is talking about living in such a way that we have an awe of God. You might know something of that when you hear the roar of those lions. It may be one of the most awe-inspiring things at the zoo. Although I must say, it's a close second. The close second is when the polar bear jumps over the glass tunnel and swims over you. I have been to that zoo, no doubt, hundreds of times. That's one of the benefits of living fairly close to the zoo. I love to go to the zoo. We go there often. The very first time I went to the zoo, I saw that polar bear swim over the glass walkway. It was amazing, and I've never seen it since. Now, I am waiting, though, for another awe-striking moment. I want to see those beavers. Those of you who have been, I would have loved to have been on the committee that came up with this multi-million-dollar beaver exhibit. These animals that are only awake at night. Someone had the good idea in the early days to have a video camera of a live stream of the beavers being active at night with this beautiful display. You saw nothing except the live stream. They got rid of that. Now there's just a BBC video repeating itself of beavers, and then they got rid of that, and there's just nothing. So it's one of these days, I think if we see the beaver, we will be awestruck. But the most awe-striking thing at the zoo is the roar of the lion. And when you hear it, you're no longer afraid of that spider. Now, if you were to change the scenery just a bit, and if the zoo became a deserted island, if you were on that deserted island alone with all those animals, and the one animal that was let loose was the lion, do you know what would happen? You would constantly live consumed by asking the question, where is the lion? You would be consumed by the lion. He would cause your heart to pump as you looked around every corner, wondering where he's at. And he would, in many ways, control the way you live your life. That's what Solomon means when he says, live with a fear of God in life under the sun. Live with the kind of awe. Live with the kind of awe of the one who created the lions. Live with the kind of awe of the one who created the sun. The kind of awe that consumes your thinking. The kind of awe that causes your heart to pump. The kind of awe that, in many ways, controls you and the way you live. God spoke through the prophet Jeremiah when he said, consider then and realize how evil and bitter it is when you forsake the Lord your God and have no awe of me. We are to live with an awe, because when we live with an awe of the creator of the sun and life under this world, in the sun, under the sun, we soon forget about the complexities and the vexing matters of life under the sun. And so we live with a certain awe, he says. Now, we also live with a certain adoration of this God and the gifts he's given. That's why he says that we are to look at verse 15. I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life. What is he saying there? Well, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says this in a negative way. If Christ has not been raised, then let us eat and drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. What he's speaking of there is to go about eating and drinking and using the gifts and pleasures of this world in an arrogant way in which we say, God, we don't need you. I will find life in another place. And what Solomon is saying here is that we don't eat and drink and be merry with the arrogance of saying we will find life in these things, but he's saying we do it with an adoration that God has undeservedly given us good gifts. And so we can enjoy a dinner with a friend or a family and laugh and enjoy a drink together. We can enjoy a building and cushions on your seat out there rather than being in the rain and the mud. We have many good gifts, ordinary gifts that God has given. And Solomon is saying in our life under the sun, we should live in an appreciation and an adoration of the God who has given us these ordinary gifts, and to live with a thankfulness, not an anxiety, but an adoration that we have these gifts before us. It's a gift, and we're to praise him for this. And lastly, we need to acknowledge that we cannot know all the business under the sun. That's what he says in verses 16 and 17. I applied my heart to wisdom to see the business that's done on earth, and we can't know it. There's no way we can find out all the work that's done under the sun. However much we toil in seeking, we cannot find it out. He's saying there, we need to acknowledge that we cannot know all that is happening. As God says through the prophet Isaiah, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. You cannot find these things out. As he said in Deuteronomy, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children. There are certain things that God has revealed. And in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says, oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Who's ever given to God that God should repay him? All things are from him and through him and to him. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Paul is saying that because something had been revealed to him that Solomon did not know about. We can know something that God has revealed that gives us an answer that Solomon didn't know about, and that is the gospel. Paul is responding here saying, I have no idea why God does what he does, but what we do know is that he gave his son. This is the good news of the gospel. It's news of God who has given us something free, and he says, I do own you. I'm giving you something free, and when you receive this free gift, I do own you. But unlike my friend Alfredo, when they were giving something free and owned to their hurt, it was bad news. But God says, what I'm offering you for free, and when you receive it, I've bought you with a price and I own you. It is good. It is for your good. It is for your salvation. Jesus Christ came as the free gift of God into this world. The great, great, great grandson of Solomon. He came. And if anyone had ever been treated, if any righteous person had ever been treated like an unrighteous person, it was Jesus. He faced this to the fullest degree when he went to that wooden tree for the atonement of our sin, so that his blood was shed, so that all who receive him by faith are rescued from the guilt of their sin and the power of sin, and ultimately from evil authorities forever and ever, because we have the paradise of God promised to us. One of the benefits of the gospel, this free gift that God has given to you, is that you're brought into a new political system. You have a new king, and his name is Jesus Christ, and he owns you, but his ownership is good. Yes, he owns your records, but because he owns your records, he's able to wipe them clean and hold no guilt against you. Yes, he owns your future, but that is good because he is the one who is all wise and powerful and good, and he proved his love for you at the cross. He will always work for your good. Yes, he owns your business. Yes, he owns your family and your body and your money. He owns you, but it is good. That's the benefit of the gospel. It's true, we cannot seek out answers to how to live life under the sun and how to find joy here, but God can reveal it, and he has revealed it in the gospel. And if you don't have the good news of Jesus Christ and the free gift he's offered and his ownership of you, then life under the sun will continue to be vexing and very dark for you. But when you have Christ, as the New Testament says, your face will shine with the glory of God because you have the knowledge of the light of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And with unveiled faces, we shine. How could we ever go forth from this place, New City, letting anyone else or anything else own us? Letting opinions of you own you, or regrets you have, or your guilt, or another person or an authority own you. The one who owns you is King Jesus, and it's so good. Amen.